Hello, this is Justin Fricky, forage and cover crop specialist with Millborn Seeds. Wanted to put together this PowerPoint as kind of a follow-up to the winter workshop series that we hosted throughout the state of South Dakota here this winter. We went to 6 different locations, and this was one of the topics that we did talk about there, and so wanted to put it up on the internet so folks could go back and look through it. And if you hadn't seen it, you missed the workshop, you could go back and listen to it and look through it as well. Really what I wanted to focus on here though was extending the grazing season and at least get you thinking about different ways to try and extend your grazing season with whatever class of livestock that may be. So I got a couple different quotes here to just get your brains a-flowing and kind of thinking on a few different things. The first one you see here is let your cows feed themselves. And I think too often we get in that same rut or rotation of constantly having the cows manage our lives. You know, I think farmers and ranchers are such good stewards of the land and their livestock as well. And too often we get caught up in that same routine and we don't really think about how much time we're actually spending feeding the cows. You know, and so that's really what this whole idea is about, is to try to get you away from doing that so much, because we know in the long run if cows can actually go out and forage for themselves, that we're really going to save a whole lot of money. The other quote up here is something I don't think a lot of folks think about. Your winter feeding begins with your first cutting. Whether it's your first cutting of alfalfa come June, your first cutting of grass, or your first chopping of silage, that's all for your winter feeding, okay? You know, when I'm talking about this with producers, I think their first thought is, well, you know, during the winter time, I don't really have a lot going on. It's not so bad going out and feeding cattle in January or February. I have to start the tractor anyways because I'm going to have to blow snow or shovel snow. So it's not really hurting me if I got to go feed cows. But when you think of it this way, that your feeding begins that early and you're spending so much time cutting hay, then raking hay, then baling hay, then moving it and hauling it, you know, that's a lot of time you put forth just for a few different months in the winter there, okay? So the first concept is nothing new to folks. You know, rotational grazing has been around for a long time, and I know that most producers do some sort of rotational grazing, but it's usually at different levels. We all know that it increases our productivity of the land, that we can increase our utilization rate, and so, you know, just something to keep in mind that if you're not doing it, it's something that there's a lot of experts out there that can help you get started, and all it is just you know, rotating through more different paddocks than what you're utilizing now, so that you're giving that land a rest to catch up and regrow before you come out and you graze on that same particular land. This is a pretty good economic analysis put together by Iowa State University. A few things to really point out there. If you take a look at you know, the tall grass continuous grazing situation, your total costs come up to about $757 versus your tall grass rotational system, and you can see there we're at $736. All right, and you can compare any of them, apples to apples, and really see when you're rotating or in a rotational grazing system versus a continuous grazing system, your total costs do diminish. Even when you have more total costs into fencing, into labor, in the end, because you're having the animals out there for a longer period of time and you can put more cows per acre out there in terms of your stocking rate, in a rotational grazing system, your bottom line is going to look a whole lot better. Strip grazing is just another tool or another method in order to allow you to increase your stocking rate. You can see in this picture here, they're strip grazing a field of what looks to be a cover crop, and that's really where it can work well. I think a strip grazing is taking rotational grazing just one step further. You know, you're allowing them to eat just a certain portion of feed by moving that first initial hot wire Then probably behind them stocker calves there's probably another hot wire that's considered a back wire, which prevents them from going back and trampling, which also allows more regrowth on that particular field. One thing that strip grazing really works well for is when you have a diverse blend like this, they can't go and pick through what they want to eat first. You know, it kind of forces them to eat everything at once. You know, so they're going to eat some of those oats in there along with the good high protein, good tasting brassicas. All right, so it really does balance their diet a whole lot better rather than having them eat all the good stuff first, and then, you know, a couple months later, all that's left is the stuff that's not as palatable to them. So swath grazing is one more of those techniques that allows us to leave the cows out on the field for a longer period of time. And really all it is, you know, so that third cutting of hay or second cutting of hay, whatever it may be for your last cutting, we're just going to leave it out there. We're not going to put the expense into the time that it takes us to bale it up and move that hay off the field. Instead, we're going to leave it in the windrow, and when winter comes, we can just turn the cows out there and allow them to go out and find that windrow and eat everything within that area. So it's just a pretty good way to minimize those last input costs of cutting hay. And as long as we are able to put up a hot wire around the area where we want them to graze, they'll go out and find that forage within the windrow. So mob grazing is another technique that's used in order to extend your grazing season. This is really taking rotational grazing to a whole nother level, okay? So we're putting livestock in a smaller area. We're increasing our stocking rate immensely. And so our stocking rate increases, but really what we're trying to do is we're trying to increase the health of that soil. Okay, we understand that when we increase the health of the soil, long term, we're going to produce more grass, right? Okay, so by increasing the amount of litter per square foot and trampling in a large percentage of grass and increase in organic matter, that's really what's giving us healthier soil. Plus, we're utilizing every single square foot by maximizing the amount of livestock on there. So our stocking rate increases, which in turn allows us to have livestock out on that land for a longer period of time. Okay? So now by far and away, I'm not an expert on mob grazing, and there's plenty of people out there that are, but I did have to try it this past summer, and you can see in this picture here, that's my 2.5-year-old son, Mason. Certainly loves to help whenever he can, rides along on the four-wheeler. As long as he doesn't touch the electric wire, he's in good shape. So I'll just run through my little scenario of mob grazing. So what I did is I had 40 ewes, and I confined them to about 2,500 square feet. Okay, so you can see how it equates out there to about 660 ewes per acre. Now that's a whole lot of ewes per acre when you think about it that way. But I wasn't even at mob grazing levels. Okay, they consider mob grazing to be 200,000 pounds per acre or more. All right, and I wasn't even at that rate. The other thing I wasn't doing is I wasn't moving more than once per day. Okay, what I do is, you know, I'm still working full time here at Millborn, so when I got home from work, I'd go and I'd move electric fence, you know, just at night, and they'd go move into the next paddock. So I just wanted to put this up here as an example of how many ewes per acre I was achieving, yet probably still wasn't at levels at what other folks are able to get. Now with that said, I still did see some dramatic differences in my pasture. You can see there the photo of the two different pastures. On the left side of the fence is a paddock that I would have been in about a week or so ago, and on the right is an area where I would have just came out of. And you can see the color difference, okay? How much faster that grass is greening up. The regrowth happens extremely fast. So I know that there's some good things happening in terms of soil health. This photo here really shows you the level of litter that we're able to achieve. You know, you can see the grass there is kind of flattened in that area because we're trampling some down and increase the amount of cover on that soil with that trampled grass, and so it's protecting it, making it more drought tolerant, putting that organic matter back into the soil so that we can ultimately get healthier soil. Kind of another big quote up here: grazing season is not limited to the period of time when forages are actively growing. All right, and that really does encompass this whole presentation of getting you to think about grazing anything that's available to be eaten by livestock, whatever it is. If it's out there and they can go and they can get it, we're gonna try to have that as part of the grazing season. So that really flows right into this slide here. Stockpiled pasture. We're able to have stockpiled forage out in a pasture when we're doing things like rotational grazing or mob grazing. Okay, that's what's allowing us to have forage later into the year. So the big thing to think about here is your time of rest. When do you need to come out of that pasture to give it enough regrowth so that you have some stockpiled forage? And really the rule of thumb is about 70 to 80 days. And of course, the longer you give it, usually the more regrowth you're going to have. But the other bullet point to think about is, you know, we oftentimes think that when we get snow, we got to start feeding hay. And, you know, certainly in 2012, this winter, we've had a very mild winter with limited snowfall. We've had snow, of course, but it's been very limited. And so keep the cows out there. As long as there's forage for them to find, they'll go out and find it. They can dig through some snow and get down through it. And if there's not ice and that snow is not crusted over, they'll push right through it and they'll go and they'll find forage. Okay, so in our stockpiled forage, palatability is probably the biggest thing to think about. They have to want to eat it, and it's got to have some nutritional value. So in order to accomplish that, to get that nutritional value at a high protein level, or to actually have some palatability, the big thing is using legumes. All right, and a lot of our pastures are pretty depleted of legumes because we've really fought broadleaf weeds, you know, through thistles especially, and so we've killed them. We've totally eliminated them from our pasture. So that's really where this whole interseeding talk begins. Is we need to incorporate legumes not only from a nitrogen standpoint for our other grasses, but also for our cattle to forage on because they're very palatable. They're going to increase that nutritional plane late in the year. All right, so how do we get those legumes out there? Well, of course, you could go out there with a no-till drill. If you have some disc openers on the front of that drill, that's awesome to kind of open up that sod and seed bed and you know, create a very good seed bed if you have that disc opener on there. But that's not always the case. So a lot of our pasture ground is pretty hilly or rocky. It's awfully rough, and so getting a drill in there may not be feasible, really. So there becomes some other techniques, and all, you know, the frost seeding. This is going out there either late fall when that ground is frozen, or early spring before that ground is thawed out and warmed up, and either broadcasting or drilling it, just allowing that seed to sit there until the soil warms up and gets wet and allows that seed to germinate. The third one up there you can see is, I just called it throw and trample. And you know, when you're rotationally grazing or you're mob grazing, this technique can work very, very well. And so you're broadcasting seed into an area where you want cows to come in, and they in turn will stomp in that seed. Obviously, it's not the most scientific technique, but it can work fairly well. And then the fourth one up there is incorporating some sort of legume seed in with your mineral, and just allowing the cows to eat it and pass it through their digestive tract, and then that seed can germinate there in the paddy. This too, it's, you know, You would think that that's absolutely hocus pocus, but surprisingly, when we get some of these legumes that have a lot of hard seed to them, that coat doesn't break through and they don't digest it, and it's passed, and we've seen some pretty decent results with it. So getting into the talk about what sort of interseeding you should be doing, or what legumes should you actually go out and put into your pasture or range. Falcata alfalfa is the yellow blossom alfalfa. It's extremely drought tolerant. So in areas where you have sandy soil, hilly areas, or with limited rainfall, this one works real well. It's got the same good winter hardiness as a lot of our alfalfas that we use up here in the northern Midwest. But the one best thing about it is its grazing tolerance. It's not a very big, tall, high-yielding alfalfa. It stays a little lower to the ground, and that in turn really allows it to come back and persist. It's got a big fibrous root system compared to what a lot of normal alfalfas have is their taproot system. And so that ultimately increases its drought tolerance. The cattle aren't going to be able to be too tough on it in terms of pulling it onto the ground or trampling it. That crown's not going to be hurt because of that fibrous root system. So if you're in areas with limited rainfall, or if you have some very sandy soils, Falcata alfalfa is probably going to be your number one choice for interseeding. Then of course we have more of your conventional type of alfalfa. We have a line called Pasture Plus, which is really a high-end creeping alfalfa. This too has that fibrous root system, which we talked about is really good for grazing, hoof traffic. Your crown's not going to be injured from grazing or from being trampled. This one's going to be just a little bit higher yielding than your Falcata alfalfa would be. It's not going to be quite as drought tolerant, but the regrowth on it is exceptionally well. It's going to persist, and it's going to respond really well from rainfall or nitrogen, and it's just going to be a good, long-lived, perennial crop that works well for interseeding in a lot of pastures. Red clover is one that tends to get forgotten. This is by far and away is the easiest legume to establish. Seedling vigor is absolutely amazing. So in areas where we get, really sod-bound pastures, this is one that if you were just going to broadcast it and expect it to grow, this would probably have your best chance of growing. The one thing to remember about red clover, though, it is pretty short-lived. It tends to freeze out here in South Dakota or Minnesota. But since it's easy to establish and it matures relatively quickly, it forms seed, and that seed oftentimes continues to grow throughout a pasture's life. The other thing is it does like moisture. So in lower areas of your pasture, wetter areas, or higher areas of rainfall, that's where this. Birdsfoot Trefoil is kind of an interesting legume. It does work fairly well for interseeding. The one thing to keep in mind that it is a little bit harder to get established. That seed doesn't have quite the vigor, and it really does need a little time to get going before you turn cows' livestock out to graze it. But once it's established, it is very rhizomatous. One of the biggest benefits is it is bloat-free, but it is pretty low yielding. It's very short in stature, and it doesn't regrow very well after grazing. It takes a long time before it goes and it stores root reserves up. And so since it's not storing root reserves at a fast level like alfalfa would, it in turn doesn't regrow quite as fast. But if you're looking for a legume to put in some lower, wetter areas, and you're concerned about bloat, this may be a pretty good one that could work for you. Cicer milkvetch. This is a neat one as well. It too is bloat-free, and it's very aggressive once it's established. The thing to remember about Cicer milkvetch, though, is there's a lot of hard seed in it. Okay, no matter what kind of Cicer milkvetch it is, what variety, you're going to find that there's a lot of hard seed. And so in that first year of establishment, your stand's going to look pretty thin. But yeah, by year 3, that Cicer milkvetch, all those hard seeds will have then germinated, and those established plants will spread pretty easily. And by year 4 or 5, you have a pretty nice stand. So it just takes a little time before it's really incorporated into a pasture. But once it's there, it's fairly high yielding. And like I said, the biggest benefit is it is a bloat-free legume. All right, so that kind of wraps up the interseeding talk about legumes. Got this picture up here of cattle just out grazing corn stalks. And I think we're pretty lucky to be in the Midwest where cash crops are growing as well as cattle are raised. And so taking full advantage of these resources is pretty important. If you don't have cattle turned down on stalks or bean stubble or wheat regrowth, look into doing that, because it really can give your pasture some rest. And certainly, the main point that we're talking about is that, once again, it's extending your grazing season. The one thing that we do fight, I think, as livestock producers is folks thinking that when we're going out and we're turning livestock out on stubble, is that we may be hurting that soil. And I think at times we can. You really want to stay away from that soil being extremely wet or moist, and you don't want to totally reap everything off of the soil in terms of stubble. But you're not going to see soil compaction, you're not going to see a whole lot of decreased soil residue cover as long as you're managing it correctly. Okay, so these are a few things to point out to landowners or folks that have raised corn and you want to be able to graze their corn stalks. This is a pretty good slide that shows some of the benefits or things that you're not going to hurt by grazing their corn stalks. Here's another really hot topic, I think, in the egg industry right now, is your cover crops. And I've got other presentations that really go through establishing cover crops and seeing the soil health benefits from cover crops. But this will just touch on ways to go about grazing them. So this is a good example of species that are suitable for grazing. Now, with that being said, almost every cover crop can be utilized for grazing, okay? But there are certain species that will provide more yield or will have better cold tolerance, so they're better for late season grazing. Just a few species to take a look. Pretty good illustration here of what we're not trying to do versus what we're trying to do. That picture on the right there is an example of a nice cover crop field with cows grazing. There are a few things to keep in mind, though, when we are grazing cover crops. The first one up there is we want to try to maintain adequate dry matter in that cow's diet. When we're coming off of pastures in September, they're awfully dry. Those grasses are going dormant. But that's also the time where these cover crops are pretty green and lush still. And so that's a really abrupt change in their diet if we're allowing them to go from that dry, dormant grass to this cover crop. Okay, so if we can offer them hay, or at least turn them out there on a full rumen, we're going to be in good shape, okay? The other thing that we can do is we can put a diverse mix together in that cover crop field, and we can put species in there that aren't going to have so much moisture. Things like millets or sorghum Sudan grasses, oats or barley. They're going to have a higher carbon to nitrogen ratio. There's not going to be nearly as much moisture through that plant. And so by them eating those along with other brassica species in that cover crop mix, that's going to allow them to balance their diet quite nicely. Okay, so the last thing to think about that we have listed up there is they do need to acquire a taste. All right, they have to adapt to it. Right away when you turn them out there and you have turnips or radishes or other brassicas, they're probably not going to like them, or at least it's going to take them a little while to figure out what they are. They've never eaten them before, okay, so they have to kind of pick at them a little bit, and then once they do acquire that taste, they'll eat the entire plant. Really, the big benefits of these brassicas, which are part of those cover crop plantings, your turnips, your radishes, your rape, Swedes, kale, they're very high in nutrition. Okay, we're talking protein percentages anywhere from 15 to 22%. They're extremely digestible because they are mostly water. And so because of that, like we talked about, watching your dry matter level intakes, it becomes important, all right? The cold tolerance is excellent on them, though. A few light frosts in October is not going to kill them. They'll continue to grow, and really it takes quite a few nights in the 20s or even the teens in some cases before that plant will actually die. And then it'll still continue to be green, and it'll hold its palatability real well. And then, of course, as then we warm up in the spring, they'll start to decompose and disintegrate. This here is a video, actually. I won't be able to play it right now, but if you go and you check out our YouTube channel, or you go through our website and look at these videos, this is a pretty good example of putting a cover crop out on oat stubble. And in this case, we got really, really dry this summer. Pasture grasses were very limited. We didn't have corn or beans harvested yet, so we had this cover crop growing out there, and so we just turned cows out on here. So really it acted as a really good emergency food source. Purple top turnips are kind of the mainstay in a lot of these cover crop grazing mixes, and for a lot of different reasons. So the turnips are part of the brassica family, so they've got that great cold tolerance. They're high in nutrition, and plus they do some really great things for the soil too. This here is just a few different examples of mixes that we would put together for grazing situations. And as you can see there, the one common component that we have is we have a grass substance in there. Whether it be sorghum or millet, Sudan grass, or barley, we have something along in that mix, just so that we're watching those dry matter levels. So that concludes the extending the grazing season PowerPoint presentation. If you form some questions throughout this, let me know. Love to talk about it. Love to talk about your operation and how you're trying to extend the grazing season, or troubles you're seeing or going through. And there's lots of different products, lots of different methods to try to do this. These are just a few of the ways that I think can help you out. But like I said, if you need anything, if you have any questions, let me know, and we'll try to help you out. Thanks for watching.